Episode 18. Last episode, I introduced you to that period after the war, which is almost ignored, between 1865 and 1868. General Grant had accepted the signature of General Lee for the unconditional surrender of the Confederates, and obviously the end of the Civil War. It was all done and dusted, right? Well, no. Then everyone went back home, and there were parties of relief that their men were home again, and people went back to work as if everything was done and all was normal again, dusted and forgotten. Right? Well, no. And reconstruction started, and the nation rebuilt itself, and all was forgiven. Right? Again, no. At least not from Gilmore's perspective, or indeed a future president's. Hi, everyone. Preparing this, I began thinking about another event 100 years later, which most of us at least know about, and some may have even gone to it or had family at it, where almost 500,000 people went to a dairy farm in rural New York and listened to music in a field far removed from any major area of population. A war, actually an increasingly unpopular war in Vietnam, was going on at this time, with America playing a huge part in its outcome. And the people who came to this festival were mainly interested in a message of unity and peace. This event was called, obviously, Woodstock, and it was massive. But people came to the event and enjoyed the music and the many other ingredients at the event. But there was no trouble, because people were united in that message of peace, and they listened to the music. So now we're going to look at P S Gilmore's idea on how he would help America after the Civil War. And by coincidence, I remind you all about Woodstock in 1969, because most of you have never heard of the Gilmore event in 1869, or in fact 100 years before Woodstock. Please click on the notification below and subscribe and like. This is one brilliant American story. By the way, have you any idea which of these two events were bigger? No? I'll tell you later at the end, and you will be shocked. This, like all of the Gilmore story, is big, and I can only cover it in sections and limited details. I hope you enjoy it. Remember from the last episode, Gilmore had a dream in New York, and he foresaw an event where there would be a vast structure built for the loyal of the land, with 10,000 voices and thousands of instruments. Again, I emphasize Gilmore's phrase that it would be filled with the loyal of the land. And so he set about telling those around him and getting feedback, as we would do today. And first to receive a description of his plan was his wife, Ellen, who listened intently, he wrote, and waited until he was finished, and one can only imagine the scene when she replied, "Are you mad? Have you lost your senses?" He wrote that, shocked But undeterred, he continued to float the idea through his friends, where he was again greeted with appropriate words like silence and caution and please move slowly. Then he met a friend of his who was then the editor of the Boston Journal, who steadfastly advised him that this was all nonsense. So take my advice. Forget it. It'll only lead to disaster and ruin. I should also declare my delight at the sheer madness, bravery, and bravado of P S Gilmore, because he was aware of the details of the project even at this stage in a rudimentary way. In fact, he was asked at that meeting just I mentioned how much it would cost to stage such an event. He replied, "Oh, a few $100,000 at least." Amazing. And in a time when a ticket for one of his Gilmore concerts was 50 cents, which was expensive in those days. An average wage, if you were very lucky, was $3 a week, or indeed a wad of chewy tobacco was little more than 2 bits. In today's money, on a most basic level, $200,000 then was worth over $4 million today, in today's money. Absolutely crazy money and crazy numbers. And as rejection followed rejection, he continued to think of music appropriate to his dreamy occasion, and wondered how he could bring it all to fruition. Amazingly, in spite of negativity, he approached people along the East Coast about possible locations for the event, such as Washington, D.C., and of course the biggest city in the land, New York. In keeping with his track record to date, rejection was the flavour of his day. With no hope of success from any location, it seemed. In Washington, he was rejected out of hand for an idea that they laughed at. And in New York, they ridiculed the idea as well as his thoughts and told him they wouldn't allow New York's name to be dragged down with such a bad idea. And so it was back to Boston with his old contacts and his old friends for the last 20 years of his career in America. Increasingly in his meetings, he began to emphasize that the primary objective of the undertaking was the restoration of peace throughout the land. But now, to that declaration, he got questions back like, is there peace really throughout the land? Or, what was the condition of the country now? Or, how do matters stand in the southern states? Or, are there clouds hanging over the political horizon? And so there was a need for clarity, and now the well-known idea of this event, the best known secret probably in America after the war, was now published in the national newspapers across the land in a document known as the Prospectus of the National Peace Jubilee Association in January of 1869. Amongst the amazing plans, apart from 10,000 choir and 1,000 musicians and 50 cannons or the use of anvils, was the plan to build a stadium to seat 50,000 people. But it was to be huge. And the biggest of all the plans was that the event would take place next June or in 6 months' time. People asked justifiably, is he mad? And back in Boston, Gilmore decided to try to generate support even from areas he had little possibilities of success, like the main critic of the time in Boston, Mr. John S. Dwight. Now, Dwight was not a Gilmore fan and felt that what Gilmore was wrong was making classical music popular amongst the masses in his concerts. And of course, in his promenade concerts. Whereas in his mind, classical music should only be appreciated by those educated upper classes in Boston, like the know-nothing members. And so the account of the meeting states that Dwight read very slowly the published prospectus of that event. And so the great National Peace Jubilee. I never like great things, he said. But whilst he didn't declare his support or his opposition of the event, he did say he would issue his reply when he was well and truly ready. And indeed, not because it suited Gilmore. And steadily, Gilmore began to attract slivers of support from sections of the city, piece by piece, meeting by meeting, and letter by letter. Beginning with the huge area of worry that even though his prospectus had declared he would have a choir of 10,000 trained singers lifting the rafters with songs of praise for the Union, while there was little more than 3 choirs in the Boston area at this time and very little throughout the rest of the Union, it would seem. And so to get the support of the Handel and Haydn Society of Boston was indeed not only a stamp of approval from a well-known choir and best-known musical organization in America at this time, but a needed recommendation by a well-known and regarded judge of music. Now that Gilmore would attract attention from such a recommendation as Handel and Haydn Society, he now had another problem. Where would he locate the other members of this vast choir in the whole of America? Quickly, Gilmore now moved his attention to project priorities and the delegation of duties to others. And for the latter, he had to interview people and find the most suitable and those who understood the aims of the prospectus and the project and agreed with all before them. No easy task at all. This stage, more than most, indicated the perseverance of the man and his ability to focus without being distracted from the task in hand, or, indeed, the aims of the project. There's little doubt he could have managed any project that he would set his mind to. And so people were hired and persuaded to manage and train the choirs, the bands and orchestras, and the various general committees for the project, including the subcommittees. It was a huge undertaking, with over 800 men alone hired to construct a building that was 500 feet long, 300 feet wide, 120 feet high. It needed 2 million feet of pine, 28 tons of nails, 25,000 feet of gas pipes, and enough seating for 50,000 people. It would be called appropriately the Colosseum. Finally, for today, the event would carry on, not for one day, but for 5 at least. But help was on the way because Gilmore's friend from the war had just been elected, and President Grant had run on a slogan that sang, "Let us have peace." This would now become the slogan of the National Peace Jubilee in Boston, and the new president, who was tone deaf, promised that he and his complete cabinet would get behind the project and come to Boston and support Gilmore's Jubilee. So, remember I asked the question back at the start, which was larger, this or Woodstock? Well, by crowds, Woodstock wins just about. Because they say almost 500,000 turned up to Woodstock, whereas the railroad companies reckoned that they brought 400,000 to Boston. But the Jubilee was bigger by the length of days, 5 days minimum, versus Woodstock, which was 1 day plus. And the Jubilee had a stadium built for the occasion versus the natural amphitheatre of a field for Woodstock. Plus, there were many more musicians in the Jubilee, and more singers, and more cannon. So, to be fair, let's declare it a draw. But both were wonderful and way ahead of their time. Next episode, more about the Jubilee and the stars. So, would you do me a favor, please click like and subscribe, and thank you for listening. And as they said back in Woodstock, far out, man. Bye-bye.